Okay, we are going to finish the screencast now, starting with Filipinos rebel. So the Filipinos very much feel betrayed when the U.S. officially annexes them from the Spanish. After the Spanish-American War, they had really hoped to maintain their full independence. And so they're actually going to now lead a rebellion against the Americans, and this is the Filipino-American War. The U.S. will actually have to fight for about 3 years to put down this rebellion, which is going to eventually cost $400 million and 4,000 American lives. So you see, we are really trying hard to maintain control of the Philippines to kind of have an access to the Pacific and Asian region. We end up paying in the war itself 20 times more than we paid for it purchasing it from Spain. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about China, because China definitely is today very relevant to our economy and our kind of global control and influence in the world, and it kind of starts really globally at the turn of the century. You know, China was pretty weak at the turn of the century. It had already been occupied by a variety of European nations, and the United States kind of feared that European occupation because it didn't want Europe to get involved with the markets in China. And so what we're going to have is John Hay is going to publish something that becomes known as the open door policy. Basically, fearing that and this is on the slide right now if you look at it, fearing that the U.S. would be excluded from the divisions of China and the influences of Europe, Secretary of State at the time, John Hay, wrote a series of policies that proposed that European nations would share trading rights with the United States. And this means that pretty much China's economy and its trade is open to all of the world. It's not closed off by Europe only benefiting. The U.S. published this policy before Europe could agree, and they were kind of forced to agree to it then to avoid a conflict with the U.S. So the mentality is that just because other European nations are occupying China does not mean they can close China's economy to the rest of the world. It's an open door to all foreign nations. This is the project I was referencing in the last screencast in terms of why the U.S. is concerned about the Caribbean. Many Americans, including the new president, President Roosevelt, felt that the U.S. needed a canal that would cut across Central America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Thus, boats don't have to go all the way around South America to access one ocean from the other. And the U.S. actually kind of spearheads this initiative and chooses Panama as the location for the canal, as it's very narrow and thin in Central America, so it's easier to cut through the land that way. The only problem with choosing Panama is that Panama was currently controlled by the South American country Colombia, and Colombia was not willing to allow the U.S. to build their canal there. So the U.S. will respond to this by helping Panama stage a war of independence from Colombia, basically giving them the men and resources needed to overthrow the Colombian government from Panama. As a thank you, Panama would agree to sell the land for the canal to the United States for about $10 million and allow the United States to have rights to the canal by leasing it for $250,000 a year. I think it's since then been fully given to the Panama government, but we still kind of oversee its regulation. Just in terms of the canal itself, I want you to know it is one of the world's greatest engineering projects. Many of the builders fought disease, malaria, yellow fever, and by the peak of its construction, more than 43,000 people were employed on this project. And this is people, besides Americans, immigrants, people from Italy, Spain, Africans, people from the West Indies. And over 5,000 people actually died on the job site because of either illness or accident. The total project cost just under $400 million. And by 1914, it was open for business. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary is going to actually serve as an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. In the late 19th century, many Latin American countries had borrowed huge sums of money from European banks in effort to help them build railroads and develop their industry. And that makes Teddy Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, feel a little nervous because he fears that if these Latin American countries are not able to pay back their loans, that European countries might intervene in Latin America in terms of trying to take over more lands again, in terms of imperializing, again, the Western Hemisphere. Which, if you recall, the Monroe Doctrine, published by published by James Monroe, President, but Secretary of State JQA wrote it, which stated that no European country was to involve itself in the Western Hemisphere because the U.S. was a dominant power. So Roosevelt kind of wanted to remind Europe about that promise, and he even further reminded them to stay out of any kind of affairs in Latin America. He based his Latin American policy on a West African proverb that he is very well known for, which is "Speak softly and always carry a big stick. You will go far." Basically referencing the fact that America will act and will be an international police power if necessary in our region. So he will tack on the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine and just warned that any kind of disorder in Latin America might force the U.S. to exercise any sort of power to protect their interests in Latin America. This is part of Teddy Roosevelt's, big stick diplomacy. Back to that quote, "Speak softly, carry a big stick." He really wanted to achieve two main goals in terms of foreign affairs for his presidency. Number one, building that canal across Central America, the Panama Canal. And number two, keeping European powers from interfering in the affairs of Latin America. He wanted to be the dominant power in our region. Woodrow Wilson will become president and kind of give the Monroe Doctrine more of a moral tone with his idea of missionary diplomacy. He basically states that more than just being a superpower, the U.S. had a moral responsibility to deny recognition to any Latin American government it viewed as oppressive, undemocratic, or hostile to U.S. interests, just re-emphasizing that we would intervene in Latin American affairs as necessary, but more so that we would maintain that whatever best promotes and defends democracy in our world, specifically Latin America. Okay, and now you are done with the Chapter 14 notes, and this is all of the notes you need to know before you come back from Thanksgiving. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday, and write down any questions you have, and we will move on when you come back on the 28th.